The lab was a mess. Papers scattered like confetti, coffee cups that had long since dried into brittle rings, and a general air of chaos that no one could ever quite explain. Dr. Alan Kessler was the kind of scientist who made mad genius look like an art form. His hair, wild and unkempt, his lab coat perpetually wrinkled, was a living testament to his deep, albeit strange, dedication to science. Today, however, the state of the lab wasn't from lack of discipline, it was from a full-on quantum disaster. Kessler. We need a decision, now. Clara's voice was sharp and urgent, but it was laced with something Kessler found almost endearing, the sound of a woman who had reached the end of her rope with him. Doctor. Kessler glanced up, blinking as if just waking up from a long nap. His eyes darted around the lab as if trying to remember what had been happening the last few hours. The tiny hamster in the cage next to his desk, which had just yesterday been casually nibbling on a piece of carrot, was now darting around in bizarre little circles that seemed to stretch and shrink with every turn, as if the very concept of movement was out of sync with reality. Oh, yeah. Right. The thing, Kessler muttered distractedly, motioning to the large, blinking contraption he'd spent the last few months building, wires sticking out at odd angles like a science fiction fever dream. The machine that might stop the virus. Maybe. Or not. Who knows at this point? Clara stared at him, hands on her hips. Kessler, this isn't some obscure theory you're working on here. People are freezing in time all over the world. Entire towns are gone stuck in limbo. And you're building a time machine in the middle of it all like you're trying to fix your microwave. Kessler opened his mouth to argue but was cut off by a loud, high-pitched beeping coming from the time displacement device in the center of the room. The blinking lights turned from blue to red in a pattern that suggested either imminent success or impending disaster, and neither outcome was particularly comforting. Clara groaned. What did you do this time? Kessler leaned forward, squinting at the readouts. I think I just made a small error. Or maybe not. Maybe it's fine. But you're insane, Clara said flatly, but with a hint of affection that suggested she'd long ago accepted Kessler's madness. She grabbed a clipboard and started scribbling furiously on the nearest whiteboard. I can't believe this is where we are. A quantum virus is altering the very fabric of time and you're letting it run its course? Kessler interrupted, leaning back and kicking his feet up onto the desk with a mischievous grin. You know what they say, Clara, you can't stop the flow of time, unless you can. Clara just sighed, too tired to argue. It wasn't like she hadn't tried. They'd been at this for weeks, months even, and yet Kessler still couldn't seem to focus long enough to finish a coherent thought. But here they were, on the brink of either saving the world or bringing about its complete collapse. She wasn't sure which outcome seemed more likely anymore. The problem was simple, but the solution, well, it was complex and terrifying. The quantum virus had spread like wildfire across the globe. It wasn't biological in nature but quantum, a bizarre, unpredictable anomaly that began affecting both people and objects. People who contracted the virus experienced time warping. Some people were stuck in time loops, living the same moments again and again, while others found themselves moving in slow motion or, even more disturbing, some had been completely frozen in time, unable to move or speak. Objects, too, were affected. A cup might suddenly age 10 years in the blink of an eye, while an old photograph might turn into a blurry mess of past and present, as if the very essence of time had been distilled into chaos. The world had descended into a temporal nightmare, and there was only one hope left: quantum escape. The idea was simple on paper: create a device capable of separating people and objects from the virus's temporal grip, creating a bubble of normal time around them. The problem, however, was that the technology didn't quite exist yet. The prototype Kessler had been working on for months, a machine that manipulated the fabric of time itself, was, at best, a wild gamble. At worst, it could cause the entire universe to implode in on itself. Okay, Kessler said, leaning forward again, snapping his fingers as the hamster suddenly began moving in reverse, spinning counterclockwise as though trying to go back in time. Let's test it out. One more calibration. What's the worst that could happen? Clara stared at him, her mind racing. One more calibration. The hamster is running backward in time, Kessler. It's stuck. Do you not see that? Oh, I see it, Kessler said, half giggling, half exasperated. It's an interesting anomaly, that's all. Interesting? Clara almost shouted, her eyes wide with disbelief. This is a disaster. We've got to fix this before it gets worse. The clock is ticking, and, before she could finish, Kessler had already turned back to the device. His fingers danced over the controls, ignoring Clara's protests as if he were a mad scientist on the verge of brilliance or complete failure. Just one more minute, Kessler mumbled. I think I can stabilize the flow for a moment. Give me a second. It'll work. I swear it will. Clara crossed her arms tightly and watched him work. She knew he was obsessed, but she also knew Kessler. He was always a step ahead, even when he didn't seem to be. The tension in the room was thick with uncertainty, but amidst it all, she couldn't help but smile. He was like a walking contradiction, a genius and a fool at the same time. The hum of the machine began to intensify, the air crackling with energy. Kessler grinned. Almost there, suddenly, the hamster stopped spinning. It froze, hovering mid-circle, as if caught in some kind of temporal stasis. Ah! Progress! Kessler yelled, but his enthusiasm was quickly cut short by Clara's horrified expression. That's not progress, she said, her voice trembling. The hamster flickered. For one brief, terrifying second, it seemed to be in two places at once, a quantum anomaly that defied all logic. And then, in a flash, it was gone. Kessler and Clara stared at the empty cage in silence. The lab was still. The world outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen, and then, as if on cue, the time machine emitted a loud, echoing beep. A glowing red light flared up, casting an eerie glow across the room. Oh, no, Kessler muttered, his smile fading. I think I've done it now. The red light pulsed ominously, and Kessler froze. The moment stretched long between him and Clara. The hamster had vanished. There was no trace, not even a tiny bit of fur left in its cage. Just an empty void where it once was. Clara's gaze flicked nervously from the cage to Kessler, her face pale, lips pressed together in a thin line of anxiety. I don't understand, Kessler muttered under his breath, staring at the readouts on the console. His fingers hovered uncertainly above the keyboard. This doesn't make sense. The machine wasn't even fully engaged. It was just a test. Clara stepped closer, her eyes scanning the readouts too. What did you do, Kessler? Her voice had that sharp, almost fearful edge to it now, the one that came when things had gone too far, even for her. I didn't mean to, I swear. I thought I could just stabilize it. Kessler was rambling, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. He turned to face Clara, his hands jittery, eyes wide with the kind of manic excitement that could only come from a scientist caught between genius and madness. It was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to just pause for a second, just to get a read, but before he could finish, the sound of a loud pop interrupted him. The hamster reappeared, but not in the way he expected. It popped back into existence, then froze, mid-air. Not in the same space it had just vacated, but several feet to the left, suspended between 2 points in time, as though the universe itself had momentarily lost track of it. For one breathless moment, everything hung in a suspended state, time itself seeming to hiccup as the creature floated there like an insect trapped in amber. The entire lab seemed to stop. Then, with an absurd little squeak, the hamster fell to the ground with a soft thud. Clara's eyes widened. What the hell? Nothing like this should be possible, Kessler said, his voice full of disbelief, eyes glued to the hamster as it scrambled awkwardly to its feet and scurried in a tight circle. It was like watching a cartoon in slow motion, as though everything was playing out in some surreal, warped version of reality. Kessler blinked rapidly, then rubbed his eyes, thinking maybe the lights in the lab were playing tricks on him. But no, there it was. The hamster, moving with a strange elasticity, its tiny limbs jerking with unnatural speed. "Okay," Clara said, her voice low but tinged with a certain level of panic. "This is officially out of hand." I know. Kessler shouted, spinning toward her, his face suddenly hardening with purpose. "But I'm getting closer. This is what we need. The machine, this is it, Clara. We're so close to breaking it. I can feel it." "You're not making any sense right now," Clara said, the edge of panic creeping into her words again. She grabbed a nearby stool and plopped down on it, rubbing her temples. "This isn't about feeling something. We're dealing with a time virus, Kessler. A virus that literally bends the flow of time. Do you understand that? You can't just feel your way through it, okay?" Kessler opened his mouth to respond but was interrupted by another loud pop. This time, it wasn't the hamster. It was the entire lab. The walls seemed to ripple, like they were vibrating out of sync with the rest of the world. The floor tiles, the shelves, the desk, everything around them began to shimmer, as though they were bleeding through different states of time. One part of the desk was dusted with particles of stale coffee from 3 hours ago, but the other half had a fresh stain, still wet. The two time flows were overlapping, disjointed, in a bizarre and unnerving way. "This is getting dangerous, Kessler," Clara said, her voice rising now. "Do you see this? Do you see what you've done?" "Clara, listen to me," Kessler said, his voice tense but filled with a strange, almost manic excitement. He wasn't entirely sure if the feeling was from adrenaline or fear, but he couldn't ignore the pull in his gut. "This is what we've been working for. This is the breakthrough. The virus has infected the fabric of reality itself. This machine, this is our only hope of fighting back. I'm not going to stop until I fix it. I won't let it win." "But you can't fix this," Clara shouted, standing up now, pacing in tight circles around the lab. "You're creating more problems than you're solving. Look at the hamster, look at the walls, look at everything. This isn't progress, Kessler. This is chaos. You're tampering with something you don't understand." Kessler clenched his fists, his body trembling. "I understand it more than you think. The quantum virus is a glitch in time. It's not just warping the flow of moments, it's breaking the continuity of existence itself. We're living in multiple realities at once. But we can escape that, Clara. If we can escape from this, we can restore the flow. We can save everyone." Clara didn't answer immediately. Her mind was spinning, trying to piece together what Kessler was saying. He was right in some ways. It did feel like everything was unraveling, like the boundaries of reality were shifting with every second that passed. But how could anyone escape a virus that could warp time itself? "Okay," Clara said finally, her voice lower now but still carrying a weight of concern. "Let's say you're right. Let's say you're on the verge of solving this. What happens after that? What's your endgame, Kessler? You're talking about time itself. You really think we're just going to step into some kind of time bubble and walk out unscathed?" Kessler didn't answer immediately. His eyes flickered back to the console, and he began typing rapidly, entering commands. A flicker of light danced across the monitor as new data poured in. "I don't know yet. But I'm getting closer. I can feel it. And when I figure it out, we can fix everything. The quantum escape, it's the key." Before Clara could respond, the lights above them flickered and went out, plunging the lab into darkness. Kessler cursed under his breath and pulled out a flashlight from his coat pocket, shining it around the room. The soft click of the flashlight was the only sound in the tense silence that followed, and then, they heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible hum. Clara's breath caught in her throat. What was that? Kessler's face twisted into something between disbelief and glee. I think it's working. The hum grew louder, more intense, and the air itself seemed to thicken, as if it were being drawn into the machine, like a vacuum sucking up all the space around them. It was as if time itself was being compressed, pulled into one tiny point, and everything in the lab, the air, the light, the shadows, began to stretch and distort, and then, without warning, everything snapped. Clara gasped as she was suddenly thrown forward, as though gravity had lost its grip on her. The lights in the lab blinked back to life, but the world around them was no longer the same. The hamster, the desk, the lab itself, everything was frozen. Time had come to a grinding halt. Kessler stood still, his eyes wide with awe, his breath shallow. He was alone in a world where time had stopped. But there was something else, something strange, something that felt wrong. He could feel it in his chest, the gnawing pull of reality stretching, bending, as though the universe itself was trying to tear apart at the seams. Clara was frozen in place, her face caught in mid-sentence, her mouth open, her hands still in motion. Kessler looked around the lab, his pulse quickening. He had done it. The quantum escape machine had done it. He had successfully trapped everything in a time-stopped bubble, but at what cost? Kessler stood alone in the lab, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his chest. He'd done it. He had created a moment where time itself stood still, where his world had become frozen in place. He was the only one moving, the only one unaffected by the tidal wave of temporal chaos he had unleashed. It was as if he were the last thread holding the universe together, and with each second that passed, that thread became more fragile. Clara was still frozen, her hand caught halfway to her head, a look of frustration etched on her face. Her words had been cut off in mid-sentence, like a movie that had been paused just as the actor was about to deliver the punchline. Kessler moved closer to her, watching the minute details of her frozen expression. Her eyelashes fluttered in the still air. Her lips, caught between exhaling and inhaling, had a slight quiver to them, like a portrait caught in the wind. For a moment, the stillness felt peaceful. It was quiet, unnaturally so. He could hear the faint hum of the time machine, still glowing with the faint light of an unstable quantum core. But there was something unsettling about the silence. The air felt thick, and he could almost sense the weight of time itself pressing against him. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something was wrong. Something in the very fabric of the universe was off. He reached out, placing his hand lightly on Clara's arm, feeling the texture of her jacket, frozen in time like everything else. It was strange, almost surreal, like he was in a dream. He could touch everything, move around freely, but the world itself seemed to reject the idea of change. It was like trying to move in water that refused to let you break through its surface. His fingers trembled as he withdrew his hand from Clara's arm. She looked so still, so lifeless in that moment. Kessler swallowed hard. He had done this, hadn't he? He had taken everything that was dynamic, everything that had life, and turned it into an unbroken stillness. This was the price of his success. Suddenly, the quiet hum of the time machine intensified. Kessler turned sharply, his heart racing. The machine was still active, too active. The glow around it had shifted, fluctuating between blue and red, as if it couldn't decide which side of the temporal divide it belonged to. It was pulling at the edges of reality, trying to break free of the constraints he had placed on it. Clara? Kessler whispered, his voice trembling. Clara, you have to hear me. This was supposed to be temporary. He turned away from her, taking a few frantic steps toward the machine. His mind raced through the possibilities. If he could just reverse the process, he could fix this. He could bring everyone back. He just needed to undo it. But how? The machine had always been unstable. He had known that. He had pushed it too far. Kessler felt a strange, almost magnetic pull towards the machine, like it was calling him. He took another step forward, then another, until he was standing directly in front of it. His breath came quick and shallow. He could feel the pulse of the machine beneath his feet, vibrating through the floor, through his bones. It was humming louder now, building in intensity, resonating with the very air around him. His hands hovered over the controls, but his mind was clouded with doubt. He couldn't remember the exact sequence to undo what he had done. He had built the machine to escape the virus, to trap it, but he had never intended to trap himself or the world in a timeless void. Another pulse from the machine hit him like a shockwave, sending him reeling backward. His legs buckled, and he slammed into the edge of a desk, the sharp corner digging into his side. He groaned in pain but forced himself to his feet. The machine's hum was deafening now, vibrating the very air around him. He could feel it pushing against the walls of the lab, threatening to break through. No, no, no. Kessler gasped, his voice a hoarse whisper. He staggered toward the control panel again, trying to steady himself. The readings on the screen were flashing erratically, the numbers spiraling out of control. It was too much. The machine was beyond his control. Suddenly, there was another pop, like the sound of air rushing back into a vacuum. Kessler's breath caught in his throat as the room around him seemed to shift. The frozen lab started to flicker, blurring in and out of focus. For a fraction of a second, the walls seemed to ripple like water, and Kessler's own reflection shimmered and distorted. He had to stop this. He had to stop it before it was too late. But how? What had he missed? The quantum escape machine was supposed to give him a way out, not trap him in this endless loop of stasis. There was only one thing left: to try unplug it. With shaking hands, Kessler grabbed a nearby power cable and yanked it from its socket. The machine sputtered, the lights dimming, the hum beginning to falter. And then, just as Kessler's pulse quickened with hope, a blinding flash filled the room. Kessler was thrown backward, his body hitting the floor with a bone-jarring impact. His vision blurred as the flash of light overwhelmed his senses, drowning him in a wave of dizziness and disorientation. For a moment, he couldn't hear anything. The world around him was silent, a vacuum where nothing moved, nothing made a sound. And then, slowly, as the light began to fade, Kessler felt a shift. It wasn't a grand, cataclysmic shift, but a subtle one, almost imperceptible. The humming of the machine had stopped. The air was still. He opened his eyes, blinking against the residual glow, and gasped. The lab was normal. Or at least, it looked normal. Clara was standing by the desk, looking at him with an expression of complete confusion. Her hand was still raised, frozen in midair, as if she had just been about to grab something. But now she was moving again, her eyes wide, her mouth opening and closing as though trying to process what had just happened. "Kessler," she said, her voice uncertain. "What the hell just happened?" Kessler sat up slowly, feeling the floor beneath him solid again, no longer flickering between states. "Clara," he stared at her, his voice hoarse, barely able to form words. I think we did it." Clara blinked, still processing the bizarre scene. "What do you mean? What the hell did you just do? Where's the machine? Why aren't we frozen?" Kessler's heart skipped a beat. The machine was gone. He looked around the lab, searching for any sign of it, but there was nothing. The table was empty. The wires, the lights, everything was gone. The hum of quantum machinery had faded into silence, replaced by the steady, normal rhythm of time. And then he realized. The lab, the world, had been restored. The time virus had been erased. Not just slowed, not just paused, it had been completely wiped from existence. Kessler stood up shakily, his hands trembling as he looked at Clara, who still hadn't fully comprehended what was happening. "You did it," Clara said, voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were wide with awe. "You actually fixed it." Kessler took a deep breath, his chest expanding as the weight of the moment sank in. It was over. The virus. The chaos. The endless chase to control time, it was all gone. They had escaped, but something still gnawed at him, a quiet emptiness in the back of his mind. The quantum chaos had been contained, but the world would never be the same. The timeline they had known, the reality they had existed in, was now different, untouched, restored, but irreversibly altered. Kessler smiled, a slow, triumphant smile. Yeah. I guess we did. He glanced at Clara, who still seemed caught in the process of realizing what had just happened. Her expression shifted, a flicker of realization crossing her face, followed by a sheepish look. So, she said, breaking the silence. Any chance we can get back to our coffee now? Kessler laughed, the sound breaking the tension in the room. Yeah, I think we've earned it. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the world moved forward again. Time, at last, was allowed to flow. The story ends here.